The chamber lies 47 steps beneath the Temple of Ammon at Kerak, hewn from the living bedrock over 3 centuries before this instant, sealed from the upper world by cedarwood doors reinforced with bronze, unopened to daylight within living memory. The year is roughly 1,214 years before the Common Era, the 19th year of Pharaoh Ramesses II, and the woman upon the obsidian altar has been conscious for 6 days. Her name is Kia Mitanni. She is 22 years old. Until 31 days ago, she was a noblewoman of the Mitanni kingdom, daughter of a provincial governor, educated in languages, astronomy, and the proper conduct of a woman of rank. She was taken when Egyptian forces overran her father's garrison during campaigns in Syria, transported in a wooden cage across 400 miles of desert, examined by physicians who recorded every detail of her physical state, assessed by priests who tested her reactions to stimuli she did not comprehend, and finally chosen for what the temple annals term divine service of the highest order. She has learned what that phrase signifies. She feels the chill of the obsidian against her bare back, feels the leather restraints cutting into her wrists and ankles where they have chafed the skin raw. Over 6 days bound to the stone, she smells the pungent smoke of burning kefi incense blended with something else, something organic and foul that catches in her throat and makes her retch though her stomach has been empty for 3 days. She hears the chanting of the 7 priests standing encircling the altar. Their voices rise and fall in rhythms, seemingly intended to confuse rather than to supplicate. Their words are in a dialect of Egyptian, so ancient, even native speakers would find it difficult. She sees the instruments arranged on the smaller altar beside her, copper implements whose function she has come to understand through 6 days of direct exposure, obsidian blades that capture the lamplight with edges keen enough to split a hair, ceramic vessels holding substances that sear when applied to skin, bronze tools shaped for purposes no physician would recognize, glass vials containing liquids that induce conditions she lacks words to describe. The high priest approaches. His name is Usuzermantu. He has served in this chamber for 31 years. He has conducted these rites on more than 200 women. He will conduct them on Kia for another 8 days before she is deemed prepared for the final ceremony. He does not perceive her as a person. The records he maintains, fragments of which endure in museum archives today, describe her as a craftsman might describe raw material being fashioned into a finished product. Asterisk subject responsive yet resistant. Baseline psychological structure largely intact. Recommend extended protocol with emphasis on identity dissolution. Projected readiness 14 days from intake. Asterisk. What Kia does not yet know, what she will learn over the next 8 days in ways language cannot fully convey, is that she is not being punished. She is being readied. The rituals performed upon her body and mind are not torture in the sense of extracting information or inflicting suffering as penalty for crimes. They are transformation. They are the methodical eradication of everything she was so she may become something else, a vessel emptied of self, capable of holding whatever the priests elect to place within her. 83% of women who entered this chamber never emerged with their personalities whole. 61% perished within 5 years of completing the rites, their bodies simply surrendering after their minds had already departed. 12% survived physically for decades, but were noted in temple records as present yet hollow, breathing, walking, eating when fed, yet displaying no sign of internal experience or independent thought. And 7%, those the priests regarded as their supreme achievements, became something defying modern psychological classification. They became oracles, priestesses, vessels through which the gods were said to speak. They prophesied, they healed, they channeled divine wisdom for pharaohs and commoners alike. They were revered across Egypt for the sacred power they carried. But the temple annals also note, in a clinical tone that has unsettled every modern scholar to translate them, that these 7% no longer contain the original occupant. The woman who entered the chamber was gone. What emerged was something else wearing her body, speaking with her voice, moving through the world with her face, yet fundamentally, irrevocably, not her. This is what the Egyptian high priest performed upon captive women during secret rites that the ancient world concealed for 3 millennia. This is what Hollywood cannot show you, because the reality is not dramatic violence ending in death. It is systematic psychological dismantling that continues for weeks or months or years, reshaping human beings into hollow vessels through methods modern neuroscientists identify as targeting the precise brain structures responsible for identity and selfhood. This is what you were never taught. What you are about to discover has been suppressed, mistranslated, and deliberately obscured since the moment it was first recorded over 3,000 years ago. You know of ancient Egypt. You have seen the pyramids, the golden treasures, the elaborate tombs filled with artifacts speaking of a civilization fixated on eternal life. You have learned of pharaohs and gods and the Nile's annual flood, renewing the land. You have encountered the romanticized version, mysterious, exotic, fascinating in its foreignness, yet ultimately comprehensible as an ancient culture with beliefs different from our own. But you have never learned of the chambers beneath the temples. You have never heard of the systematic processing of captive women, the priests termed divine preparation. You have never confronted the fragmentary records that describe in detached detail what transpired with hundreds of women over centuries of Egyptian religious practice. Records known to scholars for over a century, yet never translated for general audiences because their substance was deemed too distressing for public consumption. Tonight you'll uncover why certain temple complexes contain subterranean chambers without windows or natural light, accessible only through passages sealable from within, why the priestly class kept meticulous accounts of physical and psychological alterations in language modern psychiatrists instantly recognize as describing induced dissociative states. Why captive women from conquered lands were assessed not for their labor value or beauty, but for specific psychological traits the priests believed rendered them suitable vessels for divine occupation. You will learn of the 5-stage preparation protocol chronicled in. Here is the synonym. M. Rewrite of the next section, with the requested phrase included. Papyri that have been secured in museum archives since their discovery in 1874. You will learn what the stages were named, what each stage entailed, and what contemporary neuroscience discloses about why these precise methods would generate the outcomes the ancient priests professed to accomplish. You will learn about Kia Mitanni, who withstood 14 days of preparation and emerged as something the records characterize as no longer the foreign woman, but the voice of Mut. About Nefertari of Kush, who resisted longer than any documented subject and was ultimately broken through methods the priests regarded as so severe they recorded them as cautions for future application. About Isetnefert of Canaan, who perished during preparation and whose death instigated the only documented reform of temple practices in 3 centuries. About Tasseret of Libya, who feigned being broken while privately preserving her identity, who devised an escape that almost succeeded, and whose punishment, when uncovered, was chronicled in such detail that the papyrus was sealed in its own container with admonitions against reading it unless absolutely essential. You will learn what modern archaeology has uncovered in the remnants of these temple chambers, the physical proof that corroborates what the written accounts describe, the residues of substances whose effects modern pharmacologists can now identify, the skeletal remains displaying signs of extended confinement and particular forms of physical intervention. Subscribe to the SinisterEmpires if you wish to comprehend what ancient civilizations truly conducted behind the walls of their most sacred spaces. Comment below informing me where in the world you are viewing from, because Kia remains on that obsidian altar and user Montu is approaching with the implements for the 7th day of her preparation. And I am going to describe to you precisely what occurred in that chamber, what the priests documented, what the victims endured, and what the evidence unveils about practices that the ancient world concealed because even they understood certain truths were too dark for ordinary people to know. But first, I must clarify how these women came to be in these chambers at all. The Egyptian temple complexes operated networks of scouts and evaluators throughout the territories Egypt controlled or contested. These were not slave traders in conventional sense. They were specialists, priests educated in identifying specific traits the temple hierarchy believed signaled suitability for divine service. When Egyptian armies subdued new territories or raided border regions, these specialists accompanied the military forces. while soldiers gathered ordinary captives destined for labor or domestic service. The temple evaluators moved among the captured populace seeking something different. The criteria were precise and recorded in training texts that survive in fragmentary form. Age between 18 and 30 years. Physical health without significant defect. Evidence of prior education or training in complex skills. Capacity for emotional reaction when subjected to abrupt stimuli. Evidence of strong will or resistance. This last characteristic was deemed crucial because the priests believed vessels needed to contain something before they could be emptied. The initial assessment occurred in the field within days of capture. Women who passed this preliminary screening were separated from the general captive population and conveyed to regional temple complexes for more exhaustive examination. Kia Mitanni was identified during the sack of her father's fortress in what is now northern Syria. An Egyptian evaluator noted her reactions amid the chaos of the assault, how she attempted to organize other women for escape, how she continued functioning when others collapsed into paralysis, how she maintained composure even when her plans failed and she was taken. The evaluator's report survives in fragmentary form. Asterisk subject 23. Female approximately 22 years. Daughter provincial administrator. Physical specifications acceptable. Linguistic capability exceptional. Observed speaking 3 languages during capture. Psychological profile indicates strong will, high intelligence, capacity for sustained resistance. Recommendation: transport to Karnak for full evaluation. Projected suitability: high. Asterisk. Kia was not arbitrarily chosen. She was specifically selected because she possessed traits the priests believed would render her a potent vessel once those traits were annihilated and redirected. Her strength of will was not an impediment to overcome. It was a resource to be harvested. The transport to Egypt required 31 days. Kia traveled in a wooden cage mounted on a cart, exposed to sun and sand by day, to cold during desert nights. She was fed minimally, enough to sustain health, but not enough to preserve strength. She was not permitted to converse with other captives or with her guards. She was maintained in deliberate isolation from the moment of capture, initiating the process of separation from her former identity before she even reached the temple. Modern psychologists who have analyzed these transport protocols recognize them as the initial stage of what is now termed coercive control, the systematic isolation that renders subsequent psychological manipulation more potent. The priests may not have grasped the neuroscience, but they understood empirically that women who arrived alone, weakened and severed from all previous social bonds, were more receptive to procedures that followed. Approximately 1,500 women per year were conveyed to major temple complexes throughout Egypt during the height of the New Kingdom. Of these, perhaps 300 were chosen for the intensive preparation protocols. The others were assigned to less demanding forms of temple service: labor, maintenance, attendance to lower-ranking priestesses. Only those identified as having the highest potential were dispatched to the underground chambers. Kia was among the highest potential candidates the Karnak complex had received in years. Her file was marked with symbols indicating that the senior priests should be notified of her arrival, symbols signifying she would receive personal attention from user Monta himself. She arrived at Karnak on the 32nd day after her capture, weakened from the journey, disoriented from weeks of isolation, and still believing her predicament could not possibly be as dire as she feared. She was mistaken. The evaluation facility at Karnak occupied a building adjacent to the main temple complex, connected by subterranean passages permitting priests to move between structures without being observed by ordinary worshippers. The building appeared unremarkable from exterior, a storage structure perhaps, or administrative offices. Its actual function was known only to initiates of the inner priesthood. Kia was taken to this facility on the evening of her arrival, washed for the first time since her capture, fed a meal that seemed abundant after weeks of scant rations, and provided clean linen to wear. These gestures were not acts of mercy. They were preparation, the creation of a contrast between deprivation and comfort that will be utilized throughout the preparation protocol to keep subjects psychologically destabilized. The assessment commenced the next morning and lasted 3 days. The physical inspection was exhaustive in ways the surviving documents outline with clinical exactness. Physicians, priest-doctors who served the temple hierarchy, recorded every facet of her body using standardized forms refined over centuries of practice. Height, weight, proportions of limbs and torso, condition of skin, hair and teeth, flexibility of joints, responses to temperature, pressure, and pain. They tested her vision and hearing. They conducted internal examinations using methods the documents describe in terms explicit enough for translation, their nature unmistakable from context. The psychological assessment was even more comprehensive. They tested her reactions to sudden loud noises, to unexpected physical contact, to periods of darkness followed by intense light. They interrogated her about her childhood, her family, her beliefs, her fears. Questions that seemed conversational, but that the priest documented in detail for later analysis. They displayed images and objects, asking her to describe what she saw, felt, and thought. They told her stories and requested she continue them, analyzing her narrative choices for evidence of psychological patterns they could exploit. They deliberately provoked her, insults to her people, assertions about her family, suggestions about her future designed to elicit anger, despair, or resistance. Her responses were recorded. Women who displayed no resistance were often rejected at this stage, deemed unsuitable because they lacked the psychological substance the preparation protocol was designed to harvest. The evaluation records for Kia survive in fragmentary form. Astra's subject displays exceptional resistance capacity. Anger response is controlled but potent. Fear response present but subordinated to analytical function. Identity firmly rooted in cultural and familial connections. Recommend full preparation protocol with emphasis on identity dissolution. Projected timeline 14 to 21 days. Suitability rating, exceptional, asterisk. The phrase, identity dissolution, appears repeatedly in temple preparation documents. Modern psychologists recognize it immediately. The priests were not attempting to break their subjects' wills in the simple sense of forcing compliance. They were attempting to annihilate the fundamental sense of self that allows a human being to experience themselves as a continuous person across time, the psychological substrate of identity itself. The techniques they employed for this purpose were sophisticated, consistent, and demonstrably effective. What Kia was about to endure had been refined over centuries of practice, tested on hundreds of women, documented in records of priests maintained with the precision of experimental scientists recording the outcomes of repeated trials. She was assigned to Chamber 7 in the underground complex. She was given a number, Subject 147 of the current year. She was informed that her former name no longer applied, that she would not hear it again, and that uttering it herself would result in the protocol being extended indefinitely. She was taken below. The first stage of the preparation protocol was termed the severing in temple documents, a name that describes its purpose exactly. Every connection linking the subject to her prior identity was to be severed, leaving her psychologically adrift without the anchors that typically allow humans to maintain a stable sense of self. For Kia, the severing commenced within hours of her descent to Chamber 7. The chamber itself was engineered to disorient. The walls were painted black, absorbing light from oil lamps that burned constantly yet dimly. The floor was stone, cold enough to draw heat from bare feet. There were no windows, no natural light, no means to mark the passage of time. The only furnishing was the obsidian altar at the center, a black slab roughly the size of a human body, fitted with leather straps at positions corresponding to wrists, ankles, waist, and neck. She was not placed upon the altar immediately. First, she was compelled to stand in the center of the chamber while priests circled her, chanting in the ancient dialect, removing her linen garment piece by piece until she stood exposed, unable to cover herself, unable to evade the eyes examining her from every angle. Then came the first physical intervention. The temple record described it as removal of identifying features, a phrase that sounds nearly bureaucratic until you comprehend what it signified. The hair was first. Every strand of hair on her body was removed using copper razors and pumice stones, a process that took approximately 5 hours, and that the records note was to be conducted without permitting the subject to utter any sound. Modern dermatologists who have analyzed the described techniques confirmed they would have been extraordinarily painful. Copper razors of the period were sharp, but not sharp enough to cut cleanly without dragging and pulling. Pumice stones applied to skin would have caused abrasion and bleeding in sensitive areas. The 5-hour duration meant the pain was not a brief shock, but a sustained experience that would have depleted the subject's capacity to process it. But the physical agony was secondary to the psychological objective. The prohibition on sound forced Kia into a pattern of suppression that began training her to disconnect from her own responses. Each time she stifled a cry of pain, she was practicing the separation of experience from expression that the protocol was designed to induce. By the end of the 5 hours, she had learned on a physical level that her own reactions were not to be trusted, that what she felt was not to be acknowledged, that the bond between internal experience and external expression was something she must sever. When the hair removal was complete, she was placed in a bath of natron solution, the same substance used in mummification, a harsh alkaline compound that burned living skin with a searing intensity the records describe as sufficient to command complete attention. She was required to remain in the bath for 2 hours. The burns this caused would heal over the following days, but the nerve damage in some areas would be permanent, leaving patches of skin either hypersensitive or partially numb, a physical reminder of this experience that would persist for the remainder of her life. Throughout the bath, the Chan, Ting continued. The phrases repeated again and again, implanting themselves in her mind through sheer repetition. Asterisk, you are being purified. You are asterisk, becoming empty. The foreign woman dies, so the vessel may be born. You are not what you were. You are becoming what we fashion you to be. Modern psychologists recognize this technique as a form of what is now termed ideological programming. The use of repetitive verbal content during states of extreme distress to implant new beliefs that bypass ordinary critical evaluation. When the mind is overwhelmed by pain or fear, it becomes more receptive to suggestion. The priest grasped this empirically and exploited it methodically. When Kia emerged from a natron bath, she was physically altered, hairless, skin raw, visibly distinct from the woman who had descended to the chamber hours before. But the severing was only commencing. The protocol persisted for another 4 days before advancing to the second stage. The remaining days of the severing stage concentrated on breaking the subject's residual links to her former identity. On the second day, Kia was compelled to recount her life story while priests listened without reaction. She spoke for hours, her childhood, her family, her education, her hopes, her fears, everything that constituted who she was. When she concluded, the priest informed her everything she had said was false. No such person existed as the one she described. The memories she claimed were implanted fabrications. The family she believed she had never existed. She protested. Of course, she protested. Her memories were real. Her identity was real. She knew who she was. The priest responded with what they termed correction, a process that continued for approximately 12 hours. Each instant she asserted something about her past. She was penalized. The punishment was not violent in the dramatic sense. It was precise. A device applied to specific points on her body, producing intense but transient pain, confinement in a space so constricted she could not extend her limbs, exposure to temperature extremes, deprivation of water until her lips cracked and her throat burned. By the end of the 12 hours, she was no longer asserting her memories. She was merely enduring, awaiting its cessation, no longer investing energy in claims that only induced suffering. This was the intended outcome. The priests were not attempting to persuade her that her memories were false. They were attempting to sever the connection between her memories and her sense of self, to render her prior identity something she no longer automatically defended, no longer experienced as essential to who she was. On the third day, she was shown objects from her former life, items recovered during her capture. personal belongings that had been transported to Egypt specifically for this purpose. She was required to demolish them one by one. Her jewelry was melted. Her garments were burned. A letter she had carried from her mother was torn to fragments before her eyes. With each destruction, the priest chanted, "Asterisk, the foreign woman dies. The vessel is born. What was is gone. What will be is coming. Asterisk." The trauma of witnessing her possessions annihilated was deliberately intensified by the mandate that she participate. She was the one who dropped the jewelry into the flames. She was the one who tore the letter. Each act of destruction was an act of complicity, a betrayal of her former self that implicated her in her own transformation. Modern psychologists who have examined coercive control within cults and abusive relationships identify this technique as induced complicity, compelling victims to partake in their own victimization in ways that generate shame and psychologically tether them to their abusers. The priests may not have understood the mechanism, but they understood the effect. On the fourth and fifth days, Kia was subjected to what the records name memory dissolution, extended intervals of sensory deprivation alternating with overpowering sensory stimulation. She was placed in a small chamber devoid of light and sound for approximately 8 hours, then removed to main chamber where drums, chanting, and bright lights assaulted her senses for about 2 hours, then returned to darkness and silence. The cycle repeated throughout both days. Modern neuroscience elucidates what this does to the brain. Extended sensory deprivation causes the brain to generate its own stimuli, hallucinations, distortions of time, confusion regarding what is real and what is imagined. The alternation with overwhelming stimulation prevents the brain from acclimating to either state, maintaining it in a condition of continuous stress that impairs memory consolidation and destabilizes the sense of self. By the end of the 5th day, Kia was no longer certain what was real. Her memories of her former life felt distant, uncertain, potentially false. Her sense of continuous identity, the feeling that she was the same person from one moment to the next, had become fragile and unstable. She was prepared for the 2nd stage. The records document her condition at the transition point. Asterisk subject 147 has achieved primary severance. Identity markers significantly weakened. Memory access impaired. Resistance capacity reduced but not eliminated. Recommend transition to stage 2 with standard intensity. Projected completion 7 to 10 days. Asterisk. The 2nd stage of the preparation protocol was called the opening in temple documents, a name describing the psychological condition the priests sought to create. Having severed the subject's ties to her former identity, they now aimed to open her to new content, rendering her receptive to whatever they elected to install. For Kia, the opening commenced on the 6th day of her preparation. The chamber for this stage differed from the one used for severing. It was larger, with multiple altars arranged in a configuration that appeared to hold astronomical significance. The altars positioned to correspond with celestial bodies, though Kia had no way of knowing this without seeing the sky. The walls were covered with hieroglyphic texts that seemed to be prayers or incantations, though in the ancient dialect she could not fully comprehend them. She was placed on the central altar. The obsidian slab described the beginning of this account, and secured with the leather straps permitting no movement beyond the rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. The opening began with what the records name physical preparation for reception. Modern scholars who have analyzed these texts dispute exactly what this entailed, but the descriptions clarify it included intervention with the body in ways engineered to produce specific psychological states. Substances were applied to the skin, ointments and oils whose composition can be partially reconstructed from the ingredients listed in the records. Some of these soups, the enses, appear to possess psychoactive properties, absorbed through the skin and generating alterations in consciousness that the priests ascribe to divine presence, but that modern pharmacology recognizes as Drew. G effects, other physical interventions, targeted the nervous system directly. The records mention points of power on the body where pressure or stimulation produce particular responses. Modern neuroscience recognizes some of these points as corresponding to areas with high concentrations of nerve endings or to locations where specific pressure can trigger autonomic reactions. The priests may have been operating from an empirical tradition rather than anatomical knowledge, but they had identified techniques that yielded tangible physiological effects. The purpose of the physical preparation was to place the subject in an altered state, a condition of heightened suggestibility, diminished critical thought, and blurred boundaries between self and environment. In this state, the psychological interventions that followed would prove more potent. What transpired next is described in the records with a clinical detachment that renders the content more disquieting rather than less. Astor's subject was exposed to standard opening protocols for 7 days. Physical interventions continued throughout, maintaining heightened receptivity. Psychological interventions included identity replacement narratives, deity invocation sequences, possession simulation, and boundary dissolution exercises. Subject showed expected resistance during days 1 through 4, decreasing resistance during days 5 and 6, and apparent acceptance by day 7. Compliance metrics met expected parameters. Recommendation: proceed to stage 3, asterisk. Each of these named interventions can be partially reconstructed from more detailed texts describing the procedures employed. Identity replacement narratives involve telling the subject repeatedly that she was not who she believed herself to be, that she was in fact a vessel that had always existed for this purpose, that her memories of a previous life were illusions, that her true nature was now being revealed through the preparation she was undergoing. These narratives were repeated incessantly, hour after hour, reinforced by the physical interventions that kept her in a state of impaired critical thinking. Deity invocation sequences involved priests addressing her as though she were a goddess, calling her by divine names, treating her body as sacred space, and behaving in ways that assumed she was already inhabited by a divine presence. This was not pretense. The priests genuinely believed, or at least genuinely behaved as though they believed, that the preparation protocol was creating space for divine occupation of the subject's body. Possession simulation involved the priest demonstrating what occupation would resemble, showing her other women who had completed the protocol, women who spoke in altered voices and claimed to channel divine messages, who acted in ways that seemed to confirm they were no longer their original selves. Whether these women were genuinely dissociated or performing is impossible to determine from the records, but their examples served to demonstrate to Kia what was expected of her, what the end state of her transformation would look like. Boundary dissolution exercises involve physical and psychological interventions engineered to erode the ordinary sense of separation between self and other. The subject was touched continuously by multiple priests while being told she could not discern where her body ended and the divine began. She was compelled to repeat phrases denying her individual existence. She was subjected to sensory experiences designed to overwhelm her capacity to maintain a coherent sense of embodied selfhood. Modern psychologists recognize these techniques as methods for inducing dissociative states, conditions where the normal integration of consciousness, memory, and identity breaks down. The priests were not attempting to persuade Kia of anything through rational argument. They were attempting to produce a neurological state in which her sense of self literally fragmented, creating the opening through which they believed divine presence could enter. Kia endured 7 days of these procedures. By the conclusion, according to records, she had ceased resisting. She had ceased asserting her own identity. She had begun speaking in phrases the priests had taught her, identifying herself by the divine names they had assigned her, behaving as though she were already the vessel they intended to create. But the preparation was not finished. The third stage was called the binding in temple documents, a name describing the process of fixing the new identity in place, ensuring the subject could not spontaneously revert to her previous sense of self. For Kia, the binding commenced on the 13th day of her preparation. The psychological logic was precise. The severing had severed her connections to her prior identity. The opening had created space for new content and induced states where that content could be installed. But without binding, the effects might be temporary. The subject might gradually reconstruct her former sense of self, might reassert the identity that had been so meticulously destroyed. The binding was designed to prevent this. It established conditions under which the new identity would become self-reinforcing, conditions where any attempt to return to the previous self would trigger responses pushing the subject back toward the vessel identity. The primary technique was what the records call pain association. The subject was required to recite phrases describing her former identity, her name, her family, her homeland, her memories, while being subjected to pain. The association between those concepts and suffering was established through repetition. Eventually, merely contemplating her previous self would trigger the anticipation of pain, creating an automatic aversion that reinforced the new identity. The reverse association was also created when the subject spoke in her new identity, using the divine names, speaking as a vessel she was being trained to become. She was granted relief, water when thirsty, food when hungry, warmth when cold, physical comfort when suffering. The association between the vessel identity and relief was established through the same repetition that created the aversion to the former self. Modern behavioral psychology recognizes this as classical conditioning, the same fundamental process Pavlov demonstrated with dogs applied systematically to human identity. The priests may not have understood the mechanism, but they understood the outcome. Subjects who had undergone the binding process experienced automatic discomfort when contemplating their previous selves and automatic relief when inhabiting their new identities. The binding also included what the records call social reinforcement. Other women who had completed the protocol were brought to interact with subjects in the binding stage. These women, already transformed, already identifying as vessels, demonstrated the expected behaviors and provided social validation for the new identity. They welcomed subjects into their community, treating them as fellow vessels, as sisters in divine service. Modern social psychology acknowledges the power of group belonging to reinforce individual identity. Humans are social beings who partly define themselves through their relationships with others. By furnishing a community that accepted only the vessel identity, the priest generated social pressure that reinforced everything the conditioning had established. The binding lasted approximately 2 days for most subjects. For Kia, it required 3, a duration the records note as indicating exceptional psychological resilience. Asterisk subject 147, binding successful. Identity now firmly redirected to vessel integration. Asterisk by the conclusion of the binding, Kia no longer spontaneously considered herself Kia a Mitanni. When asked her name, she gave the divine name she had been assigned, Mutneb. Mut is in festival. When questioned about her past, she described herself as having always been a vessel, temporarily inhabited by a foreign identity that had now been excised. When asked about her feelings, she described peace, clarity, purpose, the resolution of inner conflict that occurs when competing identities are eliminated and only one remains. But the preparation still had one final stage. The ultimate stage was termed the completion in temple documents, a name describing both its position in the sequence and its function of finalizing the transformation the preceding stages had achieved. The completion ceremony was not primarily psychological. The psychological work was finished. Kia was, by all observable measures, successfully transformed. She identified as Mut-Emheb. She displayed no traces of her former personality. She behaved as a vessel the priests had fashioned. The completion was ritual, a formal acknowledgement of transformation, a ceremonial installation of divine presence, an initiation into a community of priestesses who served the temple through their vessel status. It was also, according to fragmentary records describing it, the occasion for the subject to be utilized for the first time in her new role. The ceremony occurred in a different chamber, larger than those used for preparation, adorned with gold leaf and precious stones, illuminated by dozens of oil lamps that filled the space with flickering light. Senior priests attended, including those who rarely descended to the underground complex. The subject was dressed for the first time since her preparation began, in white linen signifying her new status, with gold jewelry marking her as temple property. What transpired during the ceremony is described in the records with less clinical precision than the preparation stages. partly because the ceremony was considered sacred rather than procedural, partly because what occurred was interpreted differently by participants than by observers. The records indicate the subject was required to demonstrate her transformation. She was presented with stimuli linked to her former identity, objects, names, images, and required to exhibit no recognition, no response, no evidence of the person she had been. She was asked questions only Kia Mittani could have answered, and required to express genuine confusion about why anyone would expect her to know such things. She passed these tests. She exhibited no recognition. She expressed confusion that appeared genuine. Whatever Kia Mittani had known, Mudemheb apparently did not. The records then state the subject was received into service, a phrase whose meaning can be inferred from context, but whose specifics the texts do not explicitly detail. The senior priest performed rituals the texts identify as union with the divine and establishment of the vessel's function. The subject's role in these rituals was both ceremonial and physical. She was utilized in ways that marked her new status, and that the priest believed established her connection to the divine power she was now meant to channel. The completion ceremony for Kia occurred on the 15th day after her descent to the chambers. She emerged the following morning as Mudemheb, priestess of the Temple of Ammon at Karnak, vessel of divine power, woman without a past. She would serve in the temple for the next 11 years until her death from an illness the records describe as wasting of the body without visible cause, a description modern physicians recognize as consistent with the long-term effects of prolonged psychological trauma and the physical interventions documented during her preparation. She was 22 when she entered the chamber. She was 33 when she died, and according to every surviving record, she displayed no evidence of ever remembering who she had been before. Let me now relate to you the accounts of 4 other women who underwent this preparation, women whose outcomes differ from Kia's in ways that reveal the spectrum of what these rituals produced. Nefertari of Kush was brought to the temple complex at Luxor approximately 1,170 years before the Common Era. She was 25 years old, daughter of a Kushite nobleman who had resisted Egyptian expansion into Nubia. She was captured during the sack of her father's compound and transported to Egypt with roughly 40 other captive women. The evaluation process identified her as exceptional, even more resistant than Kia, more psychologically resilient, more firmly rooted in her identity. The evaluators noted she might be unsuitable for standard preparation, that her resistance capacity was so pronounced the protocol might fail entirely. The senior priest decided to proceed regardless. Nefertari's psychological strength rendered her valuable precisely because of what she could become if successfully transformed. A weak vessel was of limited use. A strong vessel, one that had contained a powerful identity before being emptied, was believed to channel divine power more effectively. The preparation followed the standard protocol through the severing and opening stages. Nefertari resisted at every juncture. She refused to cease speaking her name, despite the pain this provoked. She refused to destroy her possessions, compelling the priests to perform the destruction themselves while she observed. She preserved her sense of identity through the sensory deprivation and stimulation cycles, employing techniques she had apparently learned from Kushite spiritual traditions that valued mental discipline. By the end of the opening stage, day 12 of her preparation, she was still substantially herself. The Reis documented their concern. Asterisk subject maintains identity coherence beyond all recorded precedent. Standard protocols insufficient. Recommend extended measures. Asterisk. The extended measures are detailed in a separate papyrus, sealed with warnings indicating its content was appropriate only for senior initiates. Modern scholars who have translated this document recognize it as describing what is now termed extreme psychological pressure, methods that extend beyond the standard protocol into territory even the priests deemed extreme. Nefertari was subjected to total isolation for a period the records describe as until compliance. No food, minimal water, no human interaction of any kind. No sensory stimulation except the slow passage of time in absolute darkness. Modern research on isolation torture indicates most humans begin experiencing serious psychological effects within 2 to 3 days. Complete psychological breakdown typically occurs within 7 to 14 days. Nefertari endured 19. The account of her breakdown, written by a priest who checked on her periodically, outlines the progression in clinical terms. Asterisk day 1 through day 5. Subject continues verbal resistance. Shouts name and identity affirmations. Pounds walls. Demands release. Asterisk. Asterisk day 6 through day 10. Verbal resistance decreasing. Subject observed talking to self, sometimes in Kushite language, sometimes in Egyptian. Content appears to be self-encouragement, memory recitation, maintenance exercises. Asterisk. Asterisk day 11 through day 14. Subject largely silent. Observed sitting motionless for extended periods. When checked, appeared aware but did not respond to speech. Asterisk. Asterisk day 15 through day 18. Subject observed engaging in repetitive behaviors, rocking hand movements, vocalization of sounds without apparent meaning. When checked, did not appear to recognize observer. Asterisk. Asterisk day 19. Subject signal compliance. Assumed posture of submission. Spoke divine name assigned during opening. Requested continuation of protocol. Voice and manner entirely different from previous observations. Subject appears to have achieved severance through isolation. Recommend proceeding to binding with maximum intensity to capitalize on current psychological state. Asterisk. Nefertari was removed from isolation and processed through binding and completion within the next 4 days. She emerged as Hathor-Makhe, priestess of the Temple of Luxor, and served for 27 years until her death. But the records note something unusual about her service. Unlike other vessels who appear genuinely transformed, Hathor-Makhe displayed what the priest termed occasional recurrence of prior patterns. She would sometimes speak words in the Kushite language, apparently unaware she was doing so. She would sometimes fail to recognize individuals she should have known in her vessel identity. She would sometimes exhibit behaviors more consistent with Nefertari than with Hathor-Makhe. Isetnefert of Canaan was brought to the temple complex at Memphis approximately 1,150 years before the Common Era. She was 19 years old, the youngest daughter of a Canaanite merchant whose trading operations had violated Egyptian commercial regulations. Her capture was punitive rather than military. She was seized from her father's household as penalty for his offenses and transported to Egypt as state property. The evaluation identified her as suitable for preparation, but the notes indicate concern about her youth and what the evaluators described as insufficient psychological development. She had not yet fully formed the strong identity the preparation was designed to destroy. She had not yet accumulated the psychological resources the priests intended to harvest. The senior priest decided to proceed despite these concerns. Younger subjects sometimes transformed more easily precisely because they had less identity to sever. It might prove a straightforward case. It was not. The preparation proceeded normally through the first stage. Isetnefert displayed distress, but not exceptional resistance. The severing techniques appear to function as expected. She ceased asserting her identity. She ceased defending her memories. But during the opening stage, something failed. The records describe it as physical failure during divine preparation. The specific intervention that caused the failure is not named, but the description indicates Isetnefert experienced a physiological crisis, a sudden collapse, a cessation of breathing, an inability to be revived despite the efforts of the attending priests. She died on the 8th day of her preparation at 19 years of age in a chamber 47 steps below the Temple of Ptah. Her death was documented in unusual detail, suggesting it was considered significant beyond the loss of a single subject. Astra's subject demonstrated unacceptable fragility during standard opening procedures. Physical constitution inadequate to protocol requirements. Death occurred despite absence of interventions beyond normal parameters. Recommendation: revise evaluation criteria to better identify subjects with insufficient physical resilience. Implement additional screening for subjects under 20 years of age, asterisk. This is the only recorded instance in surviving documents of the preparation protocol being modified as a result of a subject's death. The recommended age screening appears in later evaluation texts, suggesting Isetnefret's death did produce at least one lasting change to temple practices. But the documents also reveal something about how the priests understood their work. They did not question whether the protocol itself was too harsh. They did not consider that perhaps transforming human beings through weeks of physical and psychological torture might sometimes kill them regardless of their initial health. They concluded only that the evaluation process needed to better identify subjects who could survive what they were going to experience. That the problem was selecting inappropriate raw material, not the manufacturing process itself. Modern readers recognize this as the logic of any system that processes human beings as objects. The failure is always in the material, never in the method. The solution is always better selection, never questioning whether the entire enterprise is worth the human cost. Isetnefret was buried somewhere in the Memphis temple complex. No record indicates where. Her family in Canaan was never informed of her fate. For the temple records, she was simply a failed subject, raw material that proved unsuitable for the product the priests were trying to create. Tasseret of Libya was brought to the temple complex at Heliopolis approximately 1,190 years before the Common Era. She was 28 years old, older than most subjects, the widow of a Libyan tribal leader killed during Egyptian military operations in the western desert. She was captured along with other survivors of the defeated tribe and transported to Egypt as part of the general captive population. The evaluation identified her as unusual, psychologically sophisticated in ways most captives were not, apparently experienced in the mental disciplines some tribal cultures taught their women. The evaluators noted she might resist the preparation with particular effectiveness, but that this same sophistication made her potentially valuable if successfully transformed. What the evaluator did not detect, what the records reveal only through subsequent events, was that Tasseret possessed a strategy. She had heard tales about the temple preparations from other captive women during the transport to Egypt. She understood, at least in general terms, what awaited her, and she had determined during the weeks of travel that she would survive it not through open resistance, which she understood would only intensify the treatment, but by feigning breakdown, while privately preserving her identity beneath the appearance of transformation. The preparation advanced according to standard protocols. Tasseret displayed the anticipated progression: initial resistance, gradual collapse, eventual apparent acceptance. She performed the compliance behaviors. She uttered the divine names. She identified as a vessel she was supposed to become. But internally, according to what the records exposed through the consequences of her actions, she remained Tasseret. She sustained this deception for approximately 6 months after her completion ceremony. She served as a priestess of the Temple of Ra. She participated in rituals. She fulfilled the duties expected of vessels. She displayed no signs a priest could detect of her previous identity. Then, during the night of festival when temple security was reduced, she attempted to escape. The escape nearly succeeded. She made it beyond the temple walls into the streets of Heliopolis before being recognized by a temple guard who happened to be returning from personal business in the city. She fought when they tried to apprehend her, injuring 2 guards before she was subdued. The records of what followed are among the most disturbing in the temple archives. Asterisk subject Tasseret, assigned vessel name Arotepeb, has demonstrated complete failure of transformation. Subject escaped during the festival of the inundation, was recaptured approximately 3 hours later, and has revealed under questioning that apparent compliance during preparation and service was deceptive. Subject maintained previous identity throughout, performing vessel behaviors while internally remaining the foreign woman she was before intake. This case represents an unprecedented security failure. The implications are severe. If one subject can deceive the protocols, others may have done so as well. All current vessels must be reevaluated. Preparation protocols must be reviewed for vulnerabilities. Subject Tasseret must be processed in a manner that ensures no future subject will consider similar deception asterisk. The processing of Tasseret is described in a sealed papyrus bearing warnings even more severe than those attached to Nefertari's extended measures. The document is damaged and fragmentary, but what survives indicates Tasseret was subjected to procedures extending far beyond anything in the standard protocol. Procedures engineered not merely to break her, but to make an example of her, to produce an outcome so extreme any future subject contemplating deception would understand the consequences. The document describes approximately 40 days of intervention. It details the involvement of senior priests from multiple temple complexes, gathered specifically to devise and implement methods adequate to Tasseret's resistance. It describes the systematic destruction not merely of her identity, but of her capacity for coherent thought, her ability to form memories, her basic cognitive functions. At the end of the 40 days, the records indicate Tasseret no longer spoke, not that she refused to speak, but that she was no longer capable of speech. The language centers of her brain had apparently been damaged beyond recovery. She could not communicate, could not comprehend communication, could not function in any way requiring symbolic thought. She died at approximately 31 years of age. The cause of death is recorded as failure of the body after prolonged insufficiency of the mind. Meritaten of Syria was brought to the temple complex at Thebes approximately 1,230 years before the Common Era. She was 21 years old, daughter of a Syrian priest who had served a deity the Egyptians did not recognize. She was captured when Egyptian forces destroyed her father's temple and killed her father along with most of his followers. The evaluation identified her as exceptional in a different way from other subjects, not because of her resistance capacity, but because of her psychological structure. She displayed what the evaluators described as an unusual capacity for internal dissociation, an ability to separate her conscious experience from her external circumstances that appeared to stem from religious training in her father's tradition. Modern psychologists would recognize this description as indicating someone who had already learned dissociative techniques, possibly as part of spiritual practices in her original religion. For the Egyptian priests, this was both an opportunity and a challenge. Meritaten might transform more readily than most subjects because she already knew how to detach herself from her circumstances, but she might also employ that same capacity to safeguard a core identity the preparation could not reach. The preparation advanced with Meritaten, displaying unusual responses. She did not resist in expected ways. She did not fight the severing or the opening. She seemed to flow through the protocols with a detachment the priests found difficult to interpret. Was she already transforming, or was she utilizing her dissociative capacity to protect something the protocols could not touch? The records indicate the priest decided to treat her as a successful transformation and proceed through completion. Whatever was occurring internally, her external compliance was total. She spoke the vessel name. She performed the vessel behaviors. She showed no signs of her previous identity. She was assigned as Nitha-Makeh, priestess of the Temple of Ammon at Thebes, and served in that role for 17 years. During those 17 years, she became one of the most renowned oracles in Egypt. People journeyed from across the kingdom to receive her prophecies. Pharaohs consulted her on matters of state. Her reputation for accuracy was extraordinary. She seemed to know things she could not possibly have known, to perceive connections invisible to others, to channel divine wisdom with a clarity other vessels could not match. The priest seal brought her as their greatest success. Proof the preparation protocols could produce vessels of extraordinary power. They documented her prophecies, studied her methods, attempted to understand what made her different from other vessels, so they could replicate her success. But fragments that survive suggest a different interpretation. A priest who observed her closely over many years wrote a private document, not included in the official temple records, a document discovered in 19th century excavations and held in European archives since then. I have watched Nitha-Makeh for years, and I have come to believe something the other priests do not see. When she prophesies, she is not channeling the goddess Neith. She is channeling the foreign woman she was before her preparation. The things she knows because Meritaten knew them. The insights she provides come from a mind trained in the Syrian traditions of seeing. The vessel is not empty. The vessel is occupied by the very person we tried to remove. If I am right, then our greatest success is actually our greatest failure. We have not created a divine vessel. We have created a shell that the original woman uses to survive, pretending to be what we made her while secretly remaining what she always was. The prophecies are real, but they do not come from the gods. They come from a Syrian priest's daughter, who learned to see in ways we do not understand. I have not reported this observation. What would be the point? She is useful. Her prophecies are valued. If we expose her, we would only lose a valuable asset and reveal that our protocols can fail in ways we cannot detect. Better to let her continue as she is, serving the temple in her way, believing whatever she believes, being whatever she actually is beneath the name we gave her, asterisk. Whether this priest's interpretation was correct cannot be determined from the surviving evidence. Meritaten or Nethemake died at approximately 38 years of age from causes the records describe as natural illness. No examination of her psychological state was conducted. No attempt was made to determine whether she had truly transformed or had merely learned to perform transformation while remaining herself. Modern archaeology and forensic analysis have provided physical evidence supporting what the temple documents describe. Excavations at temple sites throughout Egypt have uncovered underground chambers matching the descriptions in the preparation texts. At Karnak, archaeologists in 1923 discovered a complex of rooms beneath the Temple of Ammon that had been sealed since approximately the 8th century before the Common Era. The rooms contained obsidian slabs with leather attachments, ceramic vessels bearing residue of substances consistent with the preparations described in the text, and skeletal remains of at least 4 individuals who appeared to have died in the complex. Analysis of the skeletal remains conducted in the 1980s using techniques unavailable to the original excavators revealed patterns consistent with prolonged confinement and specific forms of physical intervention. Bone abnormalities suggested extended immobilization. Evidence of healed and unhealed injuries suggested repeated physical trauma over weeks or months. The age at death of the recovered individuals ranged from approximately 20 to 35 years, consistent with the age range documented in the temple texts. At Luxor, excavations in 1954 uncovered similar chambers beneath the temple complex. These chambers contain what appear to be residue of natron solutions in stone basins, consistent with a description of natron baths in the preparation texts. Chemical analysis confirmed the presence of natron compounds at concentrations that would cause chemical burns on prolonged skin contact, exactly as the text described. At Memphis, excavations in the 1970s discovered burial sites associated with temple personnel that included individuals who did not appear to be native Egyptians. Isotopic analysis of bones and teeth indicated these individuals had spent their childhoods in regions corresponding to Canaan, Nubia, and Libya, the source regions from which the texts indicate captive women were obtained. The burial practices suggested low-status temple personnel, rather than honored priestesses, consistent with the fate of subjects who did not survive preparation or were considered unsuccessful transformations. Modern pharmacological analysis of residues found in ceramic vessels from these sites has identified compounds consistent with psychoactive substances known from ancient Egyptian medical texts. Some of these compounds would produce dissociative effects when absorbed through the skin or inhaled as smoke, effects the priests would have attributed to divine presence, but that modern science recognizes as neurochemical alterations produced by specific molecular interactions. The physical evidence does not prove the temple documents are accurate in every detail. Archaeological evidence rarely proves anything with the certainty written records can provide, but the physical evidence is consistent with what the documents describe. The chambers exist. The residues exist. The skeletal evidence exists. Whatever happened in those underground spaces left traces that 3,000 years did not entirely erase. Modern psychologists and neuroscientists who have analyzed the preparation protocols described in the temple texts recognize techniques that remain effective for producing psychological transformation today. The severing stage employs methods modern researchers call identity attack, systematic degradation of the beliefs, relationships, and physical markers that allow a person to maintain a coherent sense of self. The combination of physical pain, sensory manipulation, and denial of identity validation produces a state where the normal psychological substrate of selfhood becomes destabilized. The opening stage employs methods that produce what is now termed dissociative trance, altered states of consciousness where the normal integration of perception, memory, and identity breaks down. The combination of pharmacological substances, physical manipulation, and psychological suggestion creates conditions in which new beliefs and identities can be installed more readily than in a normal waking state. The binding stage employs methods modern behavioral psychology calls conditioning, the systematic association of specific thoughts and behaviors with specific consequences to create automatic responses that bypass conscious decision-making. The association of the previous identity with pain and the vessel identity with relief produces precisely the kind of learned response modern conditioning research predicts. The completion stage employs methods modern social psychology calls ritual initiation, formal ceremonies that mark the transition from one status to another and create psychological commitment to the new status through public declaration and group acceptance. Each of these techniques is still used today, though in different contexts, and usually in less extreme forms. Military training uses identity attack methods to dismantle civilian identity and install soldier identity. Religious conversion experiences use dissociative techniques to create openness to new beliefs. Therapeutic treatments for addiction and trauma use conditioning methods to modify automatic responses. Initiation rituals for organizations, from fraternities to gangs to secret societies, use group acceptance ceremonies to cement new identities. What rendered the Egyptian temple protocols unusual was not the individual techniques, but their combination, their intensity, and their explicit purpose. The priests were not attempting to produce soldiers, believers, or organization members. They were attempting to produce what they considered divine vessels, human beings whose original identities had been completely supplanted by something else. Whether they achieved this goal in the metaphysical sense they believed is obviously beyond scientific evaluation, but the evidence suggests they often achieved it in the psychological sense, that they produced women who genuinely experienced themselves as different people than they had been, who genuinely could not access memories, personality traits, or identity markers from their previous lives, who genuinely function as though the preparation had replaced one person with another. Modern research on dissociative identity suggests such radical transformation of self-experience is possible, at least for some individuals under certain conditions. The human sense of identity is not as stable or unified as it normally feels. Under sufficient pressure, the psychological structures that typically maintain a continuous sense of self can fragment, allowing genuinely different modes of experience and self-understanding to emerge. The temple priests may not have understood the neuroscience, but they understood empirically what worked, and their empirical understanding, refined over centuries of practice, produced methods that modern science recognizes as genuinely capable of transforming human psychology in the ways the ancient texts describe. For Kia Mitanni, who was 22 years old when captured in Syria, who endured 14 days of preparation that destroyed everything she had been, who lived for 11 more years as Mudem had before her body gave up what her mind had lost, who died at 33 years of age, never again speaking her own name. For Nefertari of Cush, who was 25 when captured in Nubia, who resisted longer than any recorded subject and was broken through 19 days of isolation that no human mind can endure intact, who served for 27 years as Hathai, while traces of her true self surface in moments she may never have been aware of, who died at 52, still speaking words in the language of her people. For Isetnefert of Canaan, who was 19 when seized from her father's household, who did not survive the opening stage of preparation, who died on the 8th day of her transformation because her body could not endure what her mind was being subjected to, who was buried somewhere beneath the Temple of Ptah, and whose family never learned what became of her. For Tasseret of Libya, who was 28 when captured after her husband's death, who survived the preparation by pretending to be broken while secretly remaining whole, who nearly escaped only to be recaptured and subjected to 40 days of procedures that destroyed her capacity for thought itself, who lived for 3 more years as a warning to others before dying at 31, a body that had no mind left to direct it. For Meritaten of Syria, who was 21 when captured after her father's temple was destroyed, who may have survived by using the preparation rather than being destroyed by it, who served for 17 years as one of Egypt's most famous oracles, while possibly remaining herself beneath the vessel identity, who died at 38 and took the truth of what she was to her grave. For the approximately 300 women per year selected for intensive preparation during the height of the New Kingdom, for the 83% who never emerged with their personalities intact, for the 61% who died within 5 years of completing the rites, for the 12% who survived physically but were described as present yet hollow, for the 7% who became oracles, priestesses, and vessels of divine power at the cost of everything they had been, for the thousands who underwent this process across centuries of Egyptian temple practice, for the names that were taken from them, for the identities that were destroyed, for the women who entered those chambers and the empty vessels who emerged. They were not willing participants. They were captives, women taken in war, seized as punishment, removed from their families and homelands, and transported to temples where they were transformed against their will into something their captors found useful. They did not choose divine service. They were selected for it, evaluated like livestock, processed like raw material, manufactured into finished products through weeks of systematic psychological destruction. They did not become vessels because the gods chose them. They became vessels because the priests broke them, using techniques refined over centuries, documented with precision, applied with the methodical consistency of any industrial process. Their suffering was not sacred. It was policy. Their transformation was not divine. It was psychological destruction induced through torture. Their silence in the historical record was not accidental. It was the point. The preparation protocols were designed to erase not just individual identity, but any trace that there had ever been a person to erase. This is what the Egyptian high priest did to captive women during secret rituals that the ancient world concealed for 3,000 years. This is what the chambers beneath the temples were for. Not storage, not administration, not any of the mundane purposes archaeologists initially assumed. This is what the preparation protocols actually involved. Not mystical transformation, but systematic psychological destruction, using methods modern science recognizes as genuinely effective for breaking human minds. This is what the vessel priestesses actually were. Not holy women touched by the divine, but traumatized captives whose original selves had been destroyed and replaced with identities their captors found useful. The temples are ruins now. The priests are dust. The protocols have not been used for over 2,000 years. But the knowledge of what happened there persists in fragments, in documents translated only for specialists in PHY. Cycle evidence confirming the written record, in the recognition of modern psychology that these ancient techniques work. And somewhere in museum archives around the world, there are human remains recovered from those temple sites. Bones that once belonged to women who entered those chambers and never truly left. Physical evidence of lives destroyed, so temples could have vessels, oracles, and priestesses. They deserve to be remembered, not as vessels, not as priestesses, not as the divine servants the temples claim to create, but as Kia, as Nefertari, as Isetnefert, as Tasseret, as Meritaten, as the women they were before the priests took them below. Subscribe to the SinisterEmpires if you desire more concealed histories unveiled. Comment below informing me where in the world you are viewing from. Share this account with anyone who believes they comprehend ancient Egypt, but has only witnessed the pyramids and the gold. The temples harbored secrets. The chambers existed. The women merit remembrance.